particular unit of the course. This unit of the course concerns a lot of issues related to theism. Theism is a fancy word that refers to a belief in a god or gods. So the first thing I want to do is I want to point out some basic and fundamental differences between approaching something philosophically and approaching something religiously, right? There are two different fields. A lot of people assume that philosophy and religion are very much the same thing. Those assumptions are not correct. They are very, very different things, even though they have something to do with some related topics. There are topics that are discussed in both philosophy and religion, but they're discussed in very, very different ways, and I want to point out some of those relevant differences right off the bat. And so the first thing about philosophy is that it's intended to be critical. Okay, that is, it's intended to question. It's intended to look for areas in which we might be mistaken. It's intended to look for fine distinctions between related concepts to make sure that we're not mixing up two things that really are different. Those are all part of the philosopher's toolkit. Now, that is not to say that there are not philosophers who happen to be in other parts of their life religious, but when they are doing philosophy, they are doing so from a philosophical perspective, using philosophical tools of critical thinking and critical examination. Religion is intended to be foundational. That is, it's intended to start with a set of things that are simply accepted by the adherent to whichever religious tradition you're talking about. And there, of course, are many. And that's a fundamental difference, is that in looking at things from a religious perspective, you're expected to accept certain things as given. In philosophy, you are intended not to accept anything as given. Okay, and that's one of the biggest differences between the two kinds of approaches. And again, it's not as if there aren't religious people who are philosophical, or philosophical people who are religious. It's just that you're not going to be both of those things at the same time. Right, there's some compartmentalization there. And so philosophy is going to also deal with things at their most abstract level, right? That's one of the things about this unit that does tend to throw students for a loop, is that when we're talking about a god or gods, we're talking in a very, very abstract way, right? In a way that really doesn't have anything to do with the god or gods of any particular religious tradition, right? There are lots of details involved in, you ask someone, right, of any particular religious tradition, what is God like, right? And you're going to get lots of different answers. But ask a philosopher, what is God like? You're going to get this very abstract kind of definition. Again, this is not the same way of. We're not exactly talking about things in the same way here. People in religious contexts are not generally very concerned with the kinds of abstractions that philosophers tend to be concerned with. And so while both might be interested in talking about issues relating to God, they're interested in very different ways. And so the purpose for this unit, right, as part of an introductory to philosophy course, is to introduce you to the philosophical way of looking at some of these issues, because that's what this course is. It's so to develop, right, some critical thinking skills by highlighting questions in everyday life that are often unexamined, right? That are often sort of taken without some sort of question, without paying attention to fine gradations of meaning and fine distinctions and things like that, because that's part and parcel to the philosophical method and the philosophical toolbox that we're trying to develop. And of course, the only way to develop this kind of toolbox is to spend time really being critical, thinking about things that you haven't necessarily thought about before, in ways that you haven't thought about them before. The only way to get better at this sort of approach is to practice it, right? Like many other things. So first off, one of the things that is a very standard fare in introductory courses are a number of proofs that have been offered for the existence of God over the long history of philosophy, and certainly in Western thought. I should say most of what we have in terms of the kinds of writers that we're looking at are from the Western tradition, and it's not like there are no other traditions. It's just that here you are at an English-speaking institution in North America. So look, the training is largely going to be from a Western point of view. That said, here are some of the most famous proofs offered of the existence of God, and we're going to be taking a look at some of those as the text presents them. And before we get into any particular proof, I want to go over a few general ideas about what a proof of the existence of God really entails, what it would really mean, and set essentially some ground rules before we get started taking a look at some particular attempts. So first of all, the question, what is a proof? Like, what actually constitutes proof is a very reasonable question. And anytime somebody asks you to prove anything, you should say, okay, well, first off, let's agree on what actually constitutes a proof. Like, what would count as actually proving it? And so in our context, in the philosophical context, a proof is a valid and sound deductive argument, right? It's nothing more, nothing less. Because remember, if you remember all the way back to the definition of validity, which is what we started the course in, we started there for a very good reason, because it's just going to keep coming back. The definition of a valid argument, remember, is one in which it is impossible for the conclusion to be false while the premises are true. Right? So it's not possible for the premises to be true at the same time that the conclusion is false. That's important because if an argument is valid, right, then if its premises were true, then its conclusion would have to be. And then the second step of that is if the premises are indeed true, in any valid argument, that means the conclusion simply must be as well, right? So if you're faced with a valid argument and its premises are in fact true, you have no choice, barring irrationality, but to accept the conclusion. And that's what makes a proof, the fact that it's a valid and sound deductive argument. And that's a tall order. For many types of circumstances, it's a very tall order in terms of the existence of God. To get both a valid argument whose premises are also true that's what would constitute a proof in this case. And that said, let's contemplate the stakes, right, for having a kind of proof and see what happens if it works or if it doesn't work. So if a proof is sound, right, that is valid and its premises are true, then you have no choice but to believe its conclusion or else simply believe something false. Okay, again, on pain of irrationality, you simply have to accept the conclusion of a sound proof. Right, that's the whole point of having a proof. Otherwise, if you didn't have to accept the conclusion of a sound proof, there would be no point in having them, right? But there of course is, and so that's if the proof works, it works, right? Somebody comes up with an honest to goodness proof of God, then what you do is you say, wow, nice proof, and you start believing in God. That's how that works. However, if the proof fails, well, that's really all. Okay, the proof simply does not succeed, and we sort of learn nothing about the status of the conclusion, right? The fact that a proof isn't any good doesn't really bear on the overall question. And so it's not a question of, if a proof fails, well, all of a sudden the opposite must be true. That's a kind of fallacy, right? A failure to prove one thing does not entail proof of its opposite. Okay, so if a proof fails, well, all that means is that particular proof failed, and that's that. Okay. So just to give you an idea of what it looks like for a proof to fail, I've crafted one very carefully. Okay, I've gone to my utmost, and I've tried very, very hard to make sure that this proof would fail. It's actually not very hard to do this. Okay, so premise one: the moon is not made of cheese. Okay, there we go. We're going to start there. True. Good. It's always good to start with a true premise. So this premise is in fact true. The moon is not made of cheese. We went there, right? We found out for sure it was not made of cheese. We brought back little samples of it. Turns out it's made of rock. And then we didn't go back. Okay. Brondo has what plants crave. Also true. Okay. If you've seen the movie, that's, Brondo has what plants crave. So, good. There's a second premise. Now you might wonder where this argument is going. And if you were really thinking carefully, you would have known that it was going to the conclusion that Abraham Lincoln was president. If not, I'm not sure how to help you. Of course, I'm kidding. Notice our conclusion is also true here, right? It's true that Abraham Lincoln was president. And so, there we go, right? Here we have a true conclusion with a couple of true premises, and that's that. Looks like a great proof. Again, remember the definition of validity here. A valid argument is one in which it is impossible, right, for the conclusion to be false while the premises are true. Is it possible for there to be a world in which the moon is not made of cheese, in which Brando has what plants crave, and in which Abraham Lincoln was not president? Sure. Okay, so it is totally possible in this case for the conclusion to be false even while those premises are true. And what that means is that this proof just doesn't work. It's an invalid proof. Okay. That's the most common way for a proof to fail, although we'll sometimes see cases where the soundness of a particular premise is quite questionable. The truth, I should say, of the premise is questionable, meaning the soundness of the argument is then questionable. So again, this is what it looks like. So now, the fact that this proof has failed does not mean that Abraham Lincoln was not president after all, right? We all know that, in fact, he was. But this does not prove that. Okay, that's what I really wanted to get at. So the fact that a proof fails doesn't necessarily shed light on anything other than that the proof failed. Okay, so if we're going to be looking at proofs of the existence of God, we should take another stop. And this is part of the philosophical sort of rolling up the sleeves. We can never just get right into it. We have to make sure to define our terms. We have to make sure to define our approach because these issues are difficult enough, easy enough to get confused in if and if we're being sloppy and uncareful, well, then we have no hope of making any kind of progress on these kinds of issues. So let's sit down for a second and think about what sorts of properties of God might have. If we're going to, what is it that we're trying to prove the existence of? In other words, what kind of thing? And so classically, we've had some of the properties that have been involved in this sort of philosopher's God, as you might call it, the kind of God that these philosophical God proofs are aimed at. First of all, the property of what they call omnipotence, which means sort of being all powerful. So it's from this omni and potens, right? These words meaning all and powerful, right? Omniscience, right? Now, omni is the all. Science is a knowledge, right? That's a Latin word. Scire to know things, right? So omniscient means all knowing, right? And then of course there's this omnibenevolent, right? That's three Latin words: omni meaning all, right? Bene meaning good, volens meaning to will, essentially. So something that has all goodwill or something like that. So something that's all good. But of course, as we move on through some of the other arguments involved, we'll also see sometimes people will bring in this notion of a God as creative, because notice one of the things that a lot of these proofs have in common, a lot of our ideas about what a God ought to be like involves this God being creative in some way, as in creating things, and yet just being omnipotent, omniscient, and omnibenevolent doesn't actually bring any of that in there, and so we have to add this property as well. And finally, we should have to worry about whether the God we're proving would be a God with certain sort of goals or motivations. Most often, you'll find that that's not in there at all, right? And so one of the things that people who are interested in these kinds of proofs from a religious point of view will want to prove the God of a particular religious tradition, and for the most part, that kind of information just isn't in these proofs, right? Really, we're looking at some very much more abstract kind of an entity than that, and so we won't necessarily be able to say anything about what God is like other than having some of these very basic omni properties. Right, so that's kind of what we're looking at, and when we take a look at each of these proofs, it's going to be useful to circle back and say, okay, now what kind of a God would this prove if it succeeded? All right, so the first proof we're going to take a look at here is what's known as the ontological proof, which is it's a sort of a sometimes people call it the ontological proof of the existence of God, but the word ontology is from a Greek word that means being, or in some sense existence, and so it's a little bit like when people say the Sahara Desert, when the word Sahara means desert, and so it's like the desert, right? No. So the ontological proof of existence, it's like the existence proof of existence, right? So you can just call it the ontological proof, and that's good enough. And so this has been proposed a number of times. The first recorded example of this comes from St. Anselm, Sometimes it's called St. Anselm of Bec. Sometimes St. Anselm of Canterbury. He was the Archbishop of Canterbury from 1093 until his death in 1109. René Descartes, in his Meditations on First Philosophy, gives a version of this proof. He was a philosopher and mathematician, and really one of the most important thinkers of the modern period in philosophy. He was born in 1596 and died in 1650. And so this is the first proof we're going to be taking a look at, and this is its origin. So here's how it works. You start with the first premise that says, God is that than which nothing greater can be conceived, right? So keep that phrase in mind because we're going to be saying that phrase about 100 times through the course of discussion of this particular proof. So God is that than which nothing greater can be conceived. Okay, that than which nothing greater can be conceived. Sometimes people will sort of abbreviate like TTWNGCBC, right? Something like that. It's easier than writing it out 100 times or whatever. I've seen people do this in some of the philosophical literature. So. All right, great. That's your first premise. We'll talk about the premise and whether it's true or not, right? When we come back around. But we want to get the whole proof out here before taking a look at analysis of it. So the second premise, that than which nothing greater can be conceived, right? We've got that stock phrase again, must exist. Okay, so God is, this thing must exist, right? So I think you see this sort of pattern going through here. This kind of looks like a Barbarous syllogism, right? So all A's are B's, all B's are C's, therefore all A's are C's, or something like that. All things that are God are things that are that than which nothing greater can be conceived. All things that are that than which nothing greater can be conceived must be things that exist, right? Therefore, God must be a thing that exists, right? That's effectively the pattern there, and I think you get the conclusion. And so, again, our structure looks perfectly valid here, and that's the first thing to note about it, is that the structure looks valid. But we're going to be taking, again, sort of a closer look at some various parts of this. So if we want to analyze the premises, right, because again, the structure looks valid, and so then what we want to do is move on to saying, okay, if it appears to be valid, then of course, are the premises true? Well, the first premise is something like a definition, right? And if this is a reasonable definition, then we're going to have to let it stand. But of course, you might say that there are some ways in which this is perhaps not a reasonable definition of God. And so whatever this argument would prove, maybe we shouldn't necessarily be called God, right? So again, we're going to prove that than which nothing greater can be conceived. We're going to be talking about that entity. If that really does fit a definition of God, great. If not, then the proof has some problems. It doesn't quite hit what it aims at. But the big part of discussion will be on this second premise, right? This idea that than which nothing greater than can be conceived, okay, must exist. And Anselm's reasoning is very, very interesting and really a lot of fun. And so his reasoning goes something like this. He says, if you can imagine something not existing, then it is by definition not the greatest thing you can imagine. And so Anselm thinks that necessarily, if you're thinking about a thing than which nothing greater can be conceived, right? So you can't think of anything greater. If you're thinking of that thing, you must necessarily think of it as existing, right? And so because you must necessarily think of it as existing, it sort of then must exist, right? He says it's this kind of necessary consequence of just being that than which nothing greater than can be conceived, okay? Okay. So that's the reasoning here. And we want to take a much closer look at this because it's one of those things where when you explain it, you're like, okay, I guess I see how that ought to work. And yet very few people are really persuaded by it, right? You think it seems like there's some kind of magic trick going on here in terms of, funny wordplay or something. That's how this argument tends to strike most people, even people who are, committed in some way to a belief in God. They think, boy, this proof is there's something weird. There's something funny going on here. But it's really hard to sort of put your finger on what it might be. So first, let's ask, if the proof succeeded, what properties of God would it entail? Right? I think it's fairly clear that this would, if it succeeded, prove a God that would be all-powerful, because if it was less powerful than all-powerful, then you could imagine something greater, right? And same with omniscience, right? If it didn't know everything, well, then you could imagine it knowing everything and then imagine something greater, right? And so same thing with omnibenevolence, right? If it wasn't the, if it wasn't the greatest, well, then it's not the greatest thing that you can imagine, right? It's not that than which nothing greater can be conceived. And so certainly we get all those things. But of course, notice, just because we get that than which nothing greater can be conceived doesn't necessarily mean that that thing must have had to create anything ever, or wanted to, right? It's just, maybe the greatest thing in the world is not necessarily to create universes. Maybe there are things much better than universes that could be created. Maybe creating other things isn't, I don't know, this is just not necessarily in there, right? It doesn't necessarily require any creativeness. And of course, there's no sort of certain like goals or motivations or any craving of worship, any sort of particular interest in us, none of that is part of what gets proven by this particular proof. All it proves is that if God is that than which nothing greater than can be conceived, then God must necessarily exist, because that than which nothing greater than can be conceived must necessarily exist. So that's what we get. Okay, we get again a very abstract kind of an object, and if you think that it's reasonable to refer to something with those properties as God, well then we've got a kind of reasonable proof. However, we do have some objections to the proof, so some ideas about what really might be going on with it. And I wanted to start with Gaunilo's objection because because number one, it's a very common objection. It's usually the first objection that people tend to think of when they look at the ontological proof. I think ultimately this objection doesn't actually work, but it's really cool to talk about because of why we have it. The only reason we have Gaunilo's objection is because when Anselm published, right, his argument, he himself appended Gaunilo's objection to the end, right, and made a reply to it, right? So it was one of those things where he's like, look, it's important for me to try and be critical here. It's important for me to look for what might be wrong with my argument. Here's something that looked like a pretty darn good objection, and so I'm going to go ahead and put it in there, right? He says, this is a really good reason why I might be wrong here. And that is classic philosophical behavior, right? Is making sure that the very strongest arguments against your view are made known right along with your view. That's not something that comes naturally to people, right? People like to present their ideas in the strongest possible light. People tend to think of their ideas and their beliefs as kind of like their property, right? And so like say you buy a new truck and somebody says it's ugly, it hurts your feelings, right? So people feel the same way about their beliefs, right? There's like, they're my property, they're my precious, right? God forbid anything should ever happen to any of them. I wouldn't want to certainly change any of them. My goodness, right? And that's not ultimately a great way to be, but it is a fairly natural way that people are. And so this is really great philosophical work on the part of Anselm, just taking what he thought was a very good objection and just building it in and publishing it right alongside his argument. So Gaunilo's objection goes this way. He gives a counterexample which challenges the second premise. Remember, the second premise is that than which nothing greater can be conceived must exist. Okay, and so his Gaunilo's objection was saying in this, he says, I can imagine a perfect island. Okay, that is exactly the right number of palm trees on it, right? Exactly the right temperature all the time, exactly the right size, all that stuff, right? So I can imagine this perfect island. I can imagine, and I can sort of keep making it better. It's like, oh well, like there's a movie theater there that always gets some new films, just in case anyone gets bored. It's got a nice cart that'll make some really great Phillies, Philly cheesesteak sandwiches, that is, and etc. Right? I mean, whatever it is, like if you keep making it better until you just can't make it any better in your mind, and he says, just imagining this doesn't necessarily mean it has to exist. God, I can imagine the most perfect island ever, and that doesn't just mean it has to exist. It just means I can imagine a perfect island. That's all. Right? That's a fairly solid objection, really. However, I actually think that Anselm's reply works here. Anselm's reply is, he says, okay, that's really good, Gaunilo. That's very clever. You're clearly no fool. But really, the argument says that only the greatest possible thing that you can imagine must necessarily exist. Remember, that than which nothing greater can be conceived must exist. And so just because you can imagine a perfect island doesn't mean it has to exist. That's true. Just because you can imagine a perfect Philly cheesesteak sandwich doesn't mean it has to exist, right? But it seems like the very most perfect possible thing, right? The greatest possible thing, period, seems like it should have to. And that's where Anselm sort of sticks to his proof here. So I do think Anselm can overcome Gaunilo's objection. Not so much with Kant's reply, which was, I think, the first really good explanation of just what's going on here. And Kant's reply is in some ways more logically technical than I think is appropriate for an intro course, but I still think we can explain the essence of it here. And so here's a passage, right, from Kant, and he explains it this thus, right? And this is, I will say, Kant originally wrote in German, and this is a sort of heavily edited in the translation. Otherwise, it might be even more incomprehensible. Kant might have been actually the worst writer in the history of the Western world, and it's a testament to how important his ideas are that we continue to read his just absolutely garbage writing style. And again, his ideas are really fantastic and super important. He's one of the towering figures of the whole history of philosophy. But every now and then it can be real rough. This paragraph is actually not so bad and is fairly clear. So here's how he says it. I'll go ahead and just read through it. He says, "And so it is with the concept of an absolutely necessary being. Annihilate its existence in thought, and you annihilate the thing itself with all of its predicates. How then can there be any room for contradiction?" Okay, so a little bit of explanation for some of the terms here. So by annihilate, he means like just don't think of it as existing, right? And by predicate, if you remember from like grammar, every sentence has like a subject and a predicate, right? So if in the sentence Sam hit the ball, right? Sam is the subject of the sentence, and then hit the ball is the predicate of the sentence, right? And so he's like, so what's the sentence about? It's about Sam. What does it say about Sam? Well, he hit the ball, okay? And so that's what a predicate in this sense is. Kant means this in something like the logical sense, but it's close enough to the grammatical predicate that we'll go ahead and just leave that there. So the idea is if you have an object, okay, that object has properties. So if it's a baseball, it has the property of roundness, of whiteness, of, the seams have a certain texture, right? All that sort of stuff. It has the properties that it has. Okay, and so all of the predicates, that is all of the true things that you can say about the baseball, are its properties, right? The sorts of what it's like. And so what he's saying is, when you have this concept of an absolutely necessary being, that is that than which nothing greater can be conceived in Anselm's terminology, if you just think of it as not existing, right, in your mind, it goes away with all of its properties. Okay, and so Kant thinks that's not contradictory. That's not something, it doesn't generate any contradictions for you to be thinking of something as not existing, right? Even if it's in some sense like this, supposedly necessary being. And so he continues, and he's going to apply it to the example of God, which is what the ontological proof is trying to prove. So Kant says, look, God is omnipotent. That is a necessary judgment because omnipotence is part of the definition of God. If God's existence is asserted, then the existence of an omnipotent being is being asserted. But when you say God does not exist, you are not saying that God is not omnipotent, but you are saying that there exist no omnipotent beings. All of the necessary predicates of God disappear if the subject is never asserted in the first place. There is no contradiction in this. It may be contradictory for God not to be omnipotent, but it is not contradictory for God, however defined, to not exist. Right? And so this is a really kind of subtly brilliant approach here. And what it does is that it reveals that second premise, the reasoning behind that second premise, remember, that than which nothing greater can be conceived must exist, turns out to be faulty, right? It turns out that that than which nothing greater can be conceived doesn't have to exist. Okay. If it has all the properties of the thing that is the greatest thing you can imagine, okay, it must have all of those properties that it has, but existence isn't a property in that sense. is what Kant is really saying here. Another way to put this, I'm going to try with one more example. So you might say, okay, bachelors are unmarried. Okay, that's necessarily true, right? That has to be true because it's the definition of a bachelor that they be unmarried, or it's part of the definition. But the fact that that bachelors are unmarried is necessarily true doesn't mean that there have to exist any bachelors, right? It is absolutely logically possible for there not to be any bachelors, even though they have to have a certain property if they did exist. And so likewise, we have this concept of God that this proof aims at. It has to be omnipotent. It has to be omnibenevolent. It has to be that than which nothing greater can be conceived if it existed. And if it doesn't exist, well, the concept still contains all of those things, but it's just a concept, right? And that's where Kant really sort of hits the nail on the head and in a very sort of brilliant way figures out what it is that makes the argument not quite work. And so to summarize a little bit, some of the important parts of Kant's reply to the ontological proof are, first off, that the predicate exists doesn't actually add any information. Okay? So for example, if I say something about, what is Santa Claus like, right? Notice you can tell me all kinds of things. Santa wears a red suit, right? Santa delivers presents to children. Santa rides a sleigh. Santa says ho, ho, ho. Santa eats cookies and milk, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Like, there's all the sort of lore. Now, of course, when we say Santa exists or something like that, notice we don't actually add any information. Your mental picture of what Santa is like, right? Again, with the red suit and the belly that shakes like a bowl full of jelly when he laughs, etc. Right? All the popular lore. None of that stuff changes, right? And so that's one of the really interesting insights of Kant's thing. He says existence, as he puts it, is not really a relevant predicate here. So the predicate exists doesn't actually add any information, doesn't add anything to the concept, and so it can't be necessarily part of any concept. And so a second thing that he points out here is that asserting that something does not exist cannot be a contradiction, no matter what that thing is. Right? So we have a thing and we have its properties, right? Certain things have to have certain properties. For example, a triangle has to have 3 angles, right? That's necessarily part of its definition, but that doesn't mean a triangle has to exist, right? There don't have to actually exist anything with exactly 3 angles that are 2-dimensional objects or whatever. And so those are both important points that Kant points out here. And so what that does is it attacks that second premise. It turns out that it's not necessarily true that than which nothing greater can be conceived must exist, right? There may be something that is the greatest possible thing you can imagine, but just because it's the greatest possible thing you can imagine doesn't necessarily mean it has to exist. There's no real logical contradiction there. All right, so that is the ontological argument, one very famous one, and it's a lot of fun. The cosmological argument is another very famous argument. It is given to us in the form that we have in our text by Thomas Aquinas. If you've heard of a Saint Aquinas, that's the guy, right? He lived from 1225 to 1274. And he actually derived this argument from an argument made by Aristotle in the 300s BC, and that's it's like I said, it's an argument that goes back a long way, and so let's take a look at the argument itself. Actually, sorry, before getting there, I'd forgotten I'd put this in there. Cosmos, right? So the argument gets its name, right? Cosmological, from the Greek word cosmos, right, which means order. Okay, it's the opposite of chaos, which is disorder, right? Okay, so here's the cosmological argument. Premise 1 is that every effect has a cause. Okay, and if you think, yeah, that sounds good. Now, keep in mind, have we seen a claim like this before? And if you're saying to yourself, oh, that's the claim that's made by determinism, right? Determinism is the idea that every event is caused, right? Now, it never ceases to amaze me the number of students in courses like this one that will in one unit be like, oh, that's ridiculous. There's all kinds of things we do that don't have causes, determinism, blah, no way, right? Boo determinism. And then we'll see the cosmological argument be like, yes, this makes complete sense. Of course, every effect has a cause, if at the end of it we get to prove that God exists, right? And you really cannot have both views. You cannot say that determinism is false and say that every effect has a cause, because that's just what determinism is the view that every effect has a cause. That every event is a caused event, right? So here we're starting off with the assumption of determinism. Premise 2 is that there must exist a first cause that is itself uncaused. Okay, and this is actually where all the trouble is going to come in this second premise. And so we won't even have to worry about arguing about whether that first premise is true or not, because as you've seen, we've already spent an entire unit wondering about how we could ever tell whether that first premise was actually true or not. So that's going to be a barrier for this proof right off the bat. But this second premise, as it turns out, is going to be the one that causes the trouble. And then premise 3, right, is going to specify that it's God, right, is an uncaused first cause. This is where we get a kind of definition, right? If God is an uncaused first cause, or if uncaused first cause is a reasonable definition of what a God should be, then we can say something like that. So that is in the third premise there. That is the I'll highlight with the little laser pointer. That's the is of definition, right? When we say God is this, is defined as, etc. And then finally, we get the conclusion, then God must exist. Okay, so if every effect has to have a cause, and there has to be a first cause that is itself uncaused, then and if God is, right, that uncaused first cause, well, then God must exist. Okay, and so again, we've laid it out in a way that appears to be logically valid, right? That the structure seems like it really is okay, but we're going to have to look at the premises and how these premises interact with each other to see the trouble. And again, it's that second premise that's going to cause the most trouble. So if we take a look at the reasoning behind the second premise, we're gonna see some interesting stuff here. So this again goes all the way back to Aristotle. So the idea is there is either, okay, an infinite series of causes, or there is a first one. That seems logically necessary, right? Either there's a first cause or there isn't, right? If there isn't a first cause, then it just keeps going, right? Keeps going back in every direction, right? All the way, it's just an infinite series, okay? And if it's not an infinite series, well, that means it's a finite series, which means it's got a beginning, right? And an end, right? And so that's that's the idea. And so an infinite series of causes, right? This is the second part here. An infinite series of causes is absurd, right? Because nothing would be able to cause the first one. Okay, so if you think of like a chain hanging from something, it's like, well, it can't be hanging from nothing, right? There has to be something you're hanging that first link on. You can't just have an infinite chain hanging somewhere, right? That's actually an analogy used by a guy named William Paley, and the analogy does actually break down. So let's take a look at some of that reasoning there. And let's, well, actually, before we take a look at whether that reasoning is going to work, let's think about what properties of God this particular argument would give us or not. Notice it does not supply omnipotence. Okay, so a God does not have to be all-powerful in order to be an uncaused first cause. It only has to be powerful enough to cause the first thing. Right, and so consider an analogy here, right? Imagine you have built a giant domino structure, right? Imagine you've used millions of dominoes to make this, giant sort of line here. Now, you don't actually have to be strong enough to move millions of dominoes, and that actually, the weight of that might be quite considerable, okay? All you have to be is strong enough to knock one over. Right, so notice that doesn't mean all powerful. It doesn't even mean very powerful. Like, so all you have to do to knock over the first domino, just powerful enough to knock over the first domino, and that's it. That's all that's required by this proof. Also, omniscience. An uncaused first cause doesn't actually have to know anything, much less everything. Okay, so again, knowledge isn't even a requirement here, and so the kind of God this would prove is not necessarily one that knows anything. Right. Same thing with benevolence. It doesn't have to be a good God or a bad God or a God of any moral character at all in order to simply be a first cause, right? So, again, that just doesn't enter into the concept. It does, to some degree, indicate a kind of creative sort of role for the god. And I think maybe creative is probably going a little too far, just maybe originative, right? This has to be the first thing. It doesn't necessarily have to have created anything else, right? It just has to be this first uncaused cause, right? And of course, in order to be the first and uncaused first cause, you don't have to be, you don't have to have any particular kinds of goals or motivations. Um, so again, this proves a God with very few of the properties that we generally associate with any god of any particular religious tradition, and that's just you know, something to point out. Like, even if the proof succeeds, it doesn't give you a whole heck of a lot. But of course, the proof does not ultimately succeed, and here are some of the biggest reasons for that. Russell, for example, focused in on that second premise, right? That there must be right, an uncaused first cause. And so if Russell says, look, if something has to exist without there being a cause, why should God be the thing and not just the world, right? Why shouldn't just, you know, the world exist without a cause if something is going to? You know, I say, well, no, something had to cause the first cause, something had to make the world. It's like, well, okay, but by that logic, something would have had to make God, right? And that's, you know, that's not reasoning that most people would accept. And so, in a sense, the point is to challenge premise 2. Okay, there's also nothing absurd about an infinite series. Okay, you want to say, look, if there's an infinite chain, you know, there's got to have something to hang it on. Well, no, there isn't, right? If there's something to hang it on, it's a finite chain, right? You're not picturing an infinite chain if you're picturing some place that it, you know, has to hang or something like that. You know, an infinite series is an infinite series, and there's nothing absurd about infinite series. Okay, if you argue that infinite series are absurd, well, then, you know, there's a whole lot about numbers that, you know, just are going to be incomprehensible to you. So, for example, it would be like arguing that this premise 2 would be like arguing that there can't be numbers without a smallest number. Okay, you have to have a smallest number to have larger ones, right? But clearly 0.01 is smaller than 0.1. Okay, 0.001 is smaller still. Okay, and 0.0001 is even smaller than that, right? And you want to say, no, there has to be a smallest number, otherwise we can't have numbers. That's I hope you see that that's absurd, and yet that's exactly the pattern of reasoning that premise 2 asks us to accept. That, you know, there can't be, right, you know, you can't have causes without a first one. You know, and again, it's like, really, you know, again, that's like arguing that you can't have numbers without a smallest one or something like that, and we know that that's not only untrue simply, but it's absurd. The other thing is that if you look at, you know, and you know, go ahead and rewind the video and look at that original argument, but remember that first premise, it says all events are caused. And then the second premise says, no, there's something that isn't caused that caused the first thing. That first premise and that second premise, in fact, outright contradict each other. Okay, if everything is caused, well, then you can't have an uncaused first cause because everything is caused. Okay, and that's again a straightforward contradiction in the premises of the argument itself. So the cosmological argument, even though it has been very appealing, right, to very many people in very many different places and times throughout the world, it really doesn't work as a proof. And even if it did, it wouldn't really give you much. So we're gonna move on. We're gonna take a look at some other ideas. And so at this point, we're going to take a look at some of what we call sort of non-proof arguments, right? These are not arguments that purport to prove the existence of God, but instead they want to say, well, look, here are at least some reasons for believing that a God exists, even if they don't rise to the level of a kind of valid and sound deductive proof. And the first and absolutely most famous of these is something called the design argument. And Aquinas' fifth argument, right, in sort of, you know, 5 proofs or whatever, and also William Paley give a very famous argument of a version, I should say, of the design argument. And what's interesting is that this is an abductive argument in its structure, not deductive. Some fun vocabulary for you. What that means is that it's about what is the best explanation for what is observed, and so it is not strictly speaking a proof. Right, so abductive reasoning is about what the best explanation for something is. A deductive proof is, again, has, you know, those sort of premises that are intended to be structured in such a way as to logically guarantee the conclusion. It's an entirely different reasoning altogether. Explanation and argument are very different. But we can try and do it this way. And it's also a kind of psychological argument. It's an argument about psychological plausibility. If you sort of reduce it to a sort of a very basic statement, the design argument says something like this. It says, look, if I were the omnipotent, omniscient creator of a universe, okay, this is just exactly how I would have done it, right? And so to that extent, everything you see when you look around you and you see sort of, all this order and beauty and whatever, you say, aha, that must indicate, right? The best explanation for all of that order and beauty must be that there is a kind of omnipotent, omniscient, omnibenevolent creator. Okay, so notice it's not a proof exactly. It doesn't aim to be a proof, but it aims to be, say, look, the best explanation for what you see is that there must have been a God to create it. And that's been, again, probably the most famous version of these arguments that we'll take a look at. But again, we want to say, all right, say that this argument succeeds, right? That the best explanation for what we see in terms of all the order and beauty that's out there, it must be the existence of a God. What kind of God would have to exist, right? And again, we don't necessarily have the necessity for an omnipotent God, right? A God would only have to be powerful enough to create the world as we see it. That wouldn't necessarily mean that God would have to be all powerful. Perhaps very powerful, but not necessarily all powerful. Same thing with all-knowing. A God who created things as they are with a lot of order and beauty, etc., would only have had to know enough to create things as they are with all the order and beauty, and not necessarily everything. Same thing with benevolence. They wouldn't necessarily have had to be supremely good, but just good enough to make all the good things that you see. Okay. The creative aspect of it there still preserved, okay, in a fairly straightforward way. And certainly we have to assume certain sort of goals and motivations, right? You say, okay, well, if we see sort of order and beauty, then that has to be because the creator saw certain things as orderly and certain things as beautiful and wanted them to be a certain way, right? And so in a sense, you assume that the creation is intentional, right? And so God would have some forms of goals and motivations. Of course, exactly what those are would be a matter for some degree of mystery, but that's something that you get at least out of a proof or out of an argument of this kind. I shouldn't say proof, right? So I want to take a look at sort of another one of these, and we'll circle back to the design argument in a minute when we take a look at its counterpart, the other side of its coin. But I did want to mention very briefly that one of the other kinds of arguments we see in this section of the text is what's called the moral argument or the justice argument, and this is the one that's supposedly from Kant. And I'm going to kind of skim over this one, and I'm almost going to encourage you just to sort of ignore this one in the text. I know that's in some sense I don't like doing that as an instructor, but again, no book is perfect. If I wrote a textbook, there'd be other people who are very qualified to do what they do, really complaining about the decisions I made in writing that textbook. That's inevitable, and it's okay. But here's the view. So this is again due to Immanuel Kant, and what Kant argues here is not strictly an argument in favor of God's existence, but instead what Kant is saying is that in order to have the correct concept of morality, we have to think of God as existing. And the textbook does not supply you, and I think in an intro course should not supply you with enough details about Kant's metaphysics to make this sort of make sense in context. And so really, unless you know a whole heck of a lot about Kant's metaphysics, this argument will not actually make sense, right? You're going to think of it as being something that it isn't. You're going to be thinking of it as saying, oh, well, because there's such a thing as morality and justice, therefore there must be God or something like that. That's not the argument, even though I think the text really does present it as if it were. It really isn't. So yeah, I would really encourage you just to kind of glaze over that one. But in any case, even if it succeeded, right, or something like it succeeded, the kind of properties of God that it would give us are, again, not necessarily omnipotence. Okay, you don't have to have an all-powerful God in order to sort of think about morality in the proper way. God does not need to be all-knowing in order for you to think about morality in the proper way. Certainly, the kind of God that Kant has in mind here would be supremely morally good, right? But not necessarily supremely good in all ways. So I don't know. Not necessarily creative. Okay, this is not necessarily the God that would have had to create anything or anything like that. And of course, this God would have certain goals and motivations having to do with morality and justice, in order, again, to make sense of some of those, some of that. But yeah, so it doesn't get you everything here either. And just as a sidebar, I wanted to really point this part of it out because, again, people very often assume that Kant's proof says something that it doesn't really say, right? That it seems to assert that there's a kind of necessary connection between morality and the existence of God. That is, that morality couldn't exist without God, and that really isn't what Kant is arguing. I think only in the very most abstract of ways could you say he's arguing that. I just don't think that's really accurate. But in any case, that particular sort of reasoning is very common. You actually hear it a lot. There's a famous line from Dostoevsky is like, if God doesn't exist, then anything is permissible, right? Again, it's a very common idea, but it's not actually a very good idea. We've known that idea is faulty since ancient times, right? Since at least Socrates' dialogue with Euthyphro was one of his early dialogues, probably written somewhere in the 390s BC, or certainly it's set in the 390s BC. I guess Socrates was executed in 399, so it has to have been somewhat before that. So yeah, probably written at some point in the 390s. Anyway, here's the reasoning from that dialogue. And so if morality is just what God says it is, or that if morality requires a God, then one of two things has got to be true. Either A, things are moral because God commands them, right? Or it must be that God commands things because they are moral. Okay, that the relationship between God's commands and morality has to be one of those two. Okay, that just seems like logically the case. If things are moral because God commands them, then that means that whenever God changes God's mind, that morality itself would have to change. And while that sounds fairly appealing, especially to many theists, hold on a second, right? What that would mean is that there's actually nothing wrong with murder, rape, or torture per se, right? There's nothing about murder that makes it wrong, and there's nothing about rape that makes it wrong. There's nothing about torture that makes it wrong. It just happens to be something that God says not to do. Right, and that's not something that seems plausible at all, right? In fact, the thing that if we opted for this, right, that things are moral just because God commands them, then morality is just entirely arbitrary. Like, whatever God happened to say, that's the only reason, right? So, like the only thing wrong with murder is that God doesn't like it or something like that, isn't? And God doesn't have to have reasons in this view. Right. So if you want to say, okay, well, look, it's because God knows why these things are bad that he commands us not to do them. Well, then that's the second thing. That is, God commands things because they are moral. Right. And if that's what's going on, then that means there are reasons why things are right or wrong that God recognizes. Well, then that means that those reasons don't actually require God at all. Right? God isn't required in the whole moral picture in any way. Right? If things are right or wrong for reasons, and God recognizes those reasons, well, you don't need God in terms of the middleman, right? Things can be, morally correct or incorrect because of those reasons, right? So if morality isn't arbitrary, then God doesn't. In other words, morality would be independent of God. So morality is either going to be arbitrary or going to be independent of God. And I should point out this reasoning works for any moral authority. Okay, so if you want to say that, okay, well, look, I have my Aunt Gladys's theory of morality, right? Whatever my Aunt Gladys says, that's correct. So, well, either it's correct because Aunt Gladys says so, in which case you have a very arbitrary morality, or it's that Aunt Gladys recognizes the reasons why things are moral. In fact, morality then would be independent of Aunt Gladys, right? So again, this reasoning works for all possible appeals to moral authority. And again, we've known about this argument since ancient times, and it's entirely sound. So again, this idea, right, that morality requires religion in some way, or that the two are inextricably linked, is and has always been a mistaken idea. Morality is and has always been independent of those things. In fact, if you look at the writings of the most famous moral theorists in the Western tradition, people like Kant gives us a theory of morality, but at no point in his theory of morality does he say this can't work without God, right? And same with utilitarians like Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill. At no point in their moral theorizing do they say, oh, by the way, you need God in order to make this work. That's actually a very much more recent idea that has come and gone here and there over long history. Okay, so let's now talk about the problem of evil, which is the other side of the coin from the design argument. Right? The design argument says, look out at the world and see what's out there. Look at all that order and beauty. The best explanation for the presence of all that order and beauty is that there must have been a God who intentionally made it that way. Right? The problem of evil is it's not exactly a disproof of God. It's not a sort of something that aims to prove in some logical way the non-existence of God. In fact, it operates very much like the design argument, but sort of in reverse. It says, look at all the crap out there. Look at all the terrible, awful things, all the, the ugliness and disorder. And the only explanation for that being there is that there couldn't have been a God that created this on purpose, right? So that's why I say the design argument and the problem of evil are sort of two sides of the same coin. And the way the argument tends to work when it's put formally is that, first off, you start with the idea that God is omnipotent, omniscient, and omnibenevolent, right? You just take that definition with all those three omnis in it. And you say some omnipotent, omniscient, and omnibenevolent being precludes the existence of evil. That is, if God were all powerful, all knowing, and all good, then there wouldn't be any evil. And yet, right, evil exists. It's the third premise. And so that must mean that God cannot exist. And again, if you look at the structure of the argument, it's structured in such a way that makes it, the validity of the argument appears to be perfectly fine. Now, this has been probably, again, it's the very, very most famous and probably the most persuasive challenge. If you ask lots of people who do not accept the existence of God why they don't, I would guess, right, that the most common would be something like the problem of evil. And again, it's a very old problem. It's been around a very long time. I think a lot of times when somebody thinks, oh gosh, if God is so good, why do bad things happen to good people? I mean, that's one of the very oldest questions that anybody involved with any kind of religious life has ever asked. Okay, so trust me, you're not thinking of something new if you're going down that path. And so there's a tremendous amount of thought, a tremendous amount of literature, and it's really nice if you don't have to reinvent the wheel and get there yourself. You can just sort of jump right in and take a look at this very, very long conversation about this. And so if you're looking at that, one of the terms for dealing with the problem of evil is referred to as Theodicy. Right? So Theodicy, as a word, describes the project of dealing with the problem of evil, and there are broadly three approaches to Theodicy. Okay, one, you can simply accept the argument. You can say, okay, right, there is no God. Problem solved. Okay, that resolves it by saying, okay, yeah, the argument is simply acceptable. If you want to preserve the existence of God, you can take one of the other kinds of approaches, and that is that one, you might say that God lacks at least one of the key properties, right? That is, that you might deny premise one, right? You might deny the idea that God is omniscient, omnibenevolent, and omnipotent, right? You might say God is maybe only two of those three, or maybe even only one of those three things, or perhaps none of those three things, in which case then the definition doesn't hold, and then the argument, doesn't so much matter anymore. That's one way that some people have proposed to get around the argument from evil. I would say by far the most common approach, right, among adherents among theists, I should say, is the third one, which just says, well, look, there's no evil really, right? There's a way of sort of explaining it away, right, or sort of in a sense figuring out a way to have something that says, oh well, there's all sorts of things that we consider to be evil, but it's not really evil, and and so you do some of that, right? And that's the idea. So you sort of really deny the existence of evil in some real way. In fact, that denies premise three. The premise just says there is evil, right? And each approach, right, has its, of course, has its downsides for a theist. So the textbook supplies what is, in my opinion, some actually really excellent discussion about theodicy, right? I mean, I think that the author has really selected some pieces that are very, very well selected. They're good pieces to read. They're sort of clipped out very nicely. They sort of follow from one another, sort of, so you can follow this kind of a discussion. I think the book does an especially good job with these. And so really, again, don't use this lecture in any way to try and replace the reading. The reading is really the main event here. But if you think about, say the theologian John Hick, and I should just say that one of the biggest mistakes is people will tend to call him Hicks, right? Hicks, right? Put an S on the end there. That's not actually the way his name is spelled. His name is John Hick, right? And so you might talk about Hick's Theodicy, right, with an apostrophe S, but the name is John Hick. Just No S in there. There's no S in the man's last name. So anyway, the properties of God that he sort of implies, right, is that, okay, God is omnipotent, God is, sort of omniscient and omnibenevolent, and certainly, creative, okay, that is, that has created things to be in a very particular way. And of course, what makes Hick's Theodicy interesting is that he wants to speculate on the goals or motivations of God. He says, if we're going to make this a world for soul testing, right? That is, if we're going to make it a world of a particular kind to do what it is that God wants it to do, you're going to have to make things that at least look to us like evil. Okay. And so I would say that Hick falls into that third category. He's going to find a way of essentially explaining away the evil in some way from a certain perspective. You want to say it's not really evil. Okay. So you have to sort of, in a sense, deny that third premise. Right. Now, of course, that's a tall order. The downside of that is if there is no evil, it sure looks pretty evil. There's a lot of disaster and death and misery and all sorts of things that it's not too hard to find. All right. And so now let's talk about sort of some of the relationships between the sort of design, the argument from design and the problem of evil. Okay. They're both very oddly related, as I've mentioned a couple of times. The problem of evil is also psychological in exactly the same way as the design problem is, right? And so the problem is this. It says, if I were the omnipotent, omniscient, benevolent creator of the universe, then this sure isn't how I'd do it, right? I wouldn't make there be mosquitoes, right? I wouldn't make volcanic eruptions, wipe out villages. I wouldn't, et cetera, right? I mean, I wouldn't make, people die of, cancer. I wouldn't, et cetera. All, like, name your kind of various sort of misery. If I made people, I wouldn't make them to, lie to one another and murder one another and torture one another and all sorts of things that people in fact have done and do on a regular basis. So, again, that's the problem of evil, is it kind of makes this sort of psychological move. It says, look, if I were this, so omni everything, then this is sure not how I would make a world. And yet the design argument says just the opposite, right? If I were the omnipotent, omniscient, benevolent creator of the universe, this is exactly how I would have done it, right? So of course we must have had, right, an intentional being there. In fact, the most famous analogy used in the design argument comes from William Paley, this idea of this watchmaker. He says, well, look, this sort of thing can't happen accidentally. If I were to make something to tell the time, I would have made it more or less just like this, right? I would have made this kind of a mechanism. And again, that's a sort of psychological argument. And of course, I think if you look at all the imperfections of a timepiece, you might say, oh, this is the work of a very limited thing indeed, right? You could have think of all sorts of ways of making it better, and it could have been so much worse, right? Something like that. But I hope you'll notice that the same psychological move gets made in both cases, and this is where both arguments, I think, tend to really fall on their faces a bit. So think of it this way. Like, just imagine yourself just the way you are. Shouldn't be too hard. Now, imagine you're, in a grocery store, shopping for some wine. If you don't drink wine, then imagine it's something else, right? But the argument will still go. So you're trying to, buy some wine. Maybe it's some fancy cheese that you're really wanting, and you think to yourself, well, I really can't tell the difference between this here $11 bottle of wine and that their $50 bottle of wine. I mean, I've had expensive wines before. It all tastes like wine to me, and so you think, I really can't. If I really can't tell the difference, then why should I spring for the better stuff, the more expensive stuff? Right, and use whatever you like for this particular argument. But now imagine that you actually had an extra ability, just a little extra knowledge. You started to actually, you knew enough to really be able to tell the difference between the sort of the nuances of the much rarer, more expensive wine versus the cheaper one. If you did know more, you might either say, okay, it is actually worth the extra expense, or you might be, convinced in some way that you weren't before that it wasn't worth it, right? So in some sense, just having a little bit more knowledge might actually change you a lot, right? And just imagine about, if we think about power, right? Plato has this really famous story about, it's referred to as I don't think he invented the story, but, he relays it. It's called the story of the ring of Gyges. And basically it's where some guy named Gyges, right, finds this ring that allows him to turn himself invisible, right? Now, if you think, gosh, where could anybody else have gotten that idea from? Or where does it sound maybe familiar? It's originally in Plato, right? So anyway, what happens to the guy? What happens to Guy G's? Well, he turns into a real jerk. He uses it to really, sort of take advantage of people and, find people's secrets. And he just becomes a really bad dude only because he has just a little bit more power, right, than anybody else has. And so if a little bit more knowledge might change you a lot, if a little bit more power might change you a lot, right? Certainly, I don't think any of us are supremely good. I don't think anybody who's saying, "Oh yes, I'm of course." If somebody does think they're supremely good, watch out, right? Those are the ones you got to look out for. And but imagine just being a little more good would probably radically change you, right? I mean, if we were just all just a little more good, we would, as Peter Singer suggests, we'd send almost all of our disposable income to people who are suffering instead of buying things that are frankly luxuries, things that we don't really need, right? Things that don't really make our lives that much better, certainly not as much better as that money would have made somebody's life who was starving or had no shelter or desperately needed medical care, right? I mean, so again, if we were just a little more good, we'd probably behave radically differently, not just a little bit differently. And so put that all together and think about that. Like, are we in any way equipped to say what we would or wouldn't do if we were all powerful, all knowing, and all good, much less just a little bit more powerful, a little bit more knowledgeable, and a little bit more good, right? And so this is, I think, where, again, both the problem of evil and the design argument really fall on their faces, because they involve this kind of psychological, counterfactual that has just no rational basis. Okay, and so they're in the sense that they're two sides of the same coin. I think they both fall prey to the same essential problem. So again, if an argument doesn't work, that doesn't necessarily mean that the opposite must be true. It just means the argument doesn't work very well, and I think that we can see that with these here. And so finally, let's take a look at some of the last things that are implicated in this particular unit, and that is the question of belief, right? Are there reasons to believe other than having some kind of evidence? And so one of the things I do wish the text did a little bit better than it does is sort of, make a note of when we're switching branches of philosophy, when we're fundamentally changing the kind of question we're asking in the middle of a unit, even though the topic that we're dealing with seems to be, again, we're dealing with the topic of proofs of God and God's existence and all that business, right? But we're sort of making a shift from these kind of metaphysical arguments about the existence of God into questions about how reasonable certain beliefs are. Right. So ontological questions are questions about existence. They're questions that we call these metaphysical questions, that they belong in the branch of philosophy called metaphysics, or more specifically ontology. Whereas this section of the text concerns questions about the reasonableness of beliefs. Okay, these are what we call epistemological questions. They live in a different area of philosophy because they're a different kind of question. And I hope you see why they're sort of a different kind of question. So it's saying what exists and what reasons do we have for thinking so are very, very much two different kinds of questions that require two different kinds of approaches. And so there are four things I want to mention, and I'm only going to mention them briefly because I actually think the readings themselves are pretty good and are fairly clear if you're taking enough time to look at them in a very careful way. And so I just wanted to say a few things about each of them to be sort of careful of and to make sure to note about some of these issues, right? So first off is Pascal's wager, right? Again, a very famous argument, and it's a lot of fun to think about, And so Pascal says, look, say that you go ahead and decide to believe in a God, because if you do believe in God, then you can go to heaven. If you don't believe in God, you'll go to hell. But if there isn't a God, well, then that's it, and you didn't lose anything by believing, right? So the costs, he said, of sort of betting against God are much greater than, if you're wrong, right? Than the costs of betting in favor of God, are if you're wrong. And so he's like, just imagine, so he did sort of cost benefit analysis of the belief, right? It's in a sense like, he ends up saying, hey, look, better safe than sorry, right? Take the thing that has less ultimate cost. Some people have actually been persuaded by this argument. Ultimately, it's a really terrible argument because for reasons that are in the text, one of which you might say, well, look, what if God is such that he would punish those especially severely who used something like Pascal's wager, who that is believed only on these sort of probabilistic or, consequential grounds instead of, believing for better reasons or something something like that. And of course that's possible, right? Again, it sort of makes all these assumptions about the psychology of God that we may not be warranted in making. One of the most prominent arguments that's in this section, and one that you should definitely pay some very significant attention to, is Clifford's argument. And his argument is that it is irresponsible, immoral even, to believe things generally, right, for which you lack very good evidence. And I think it's important to pay attention to specifically why he says so, right? What is it about not having enough evidence that makes it immoral or improper to believe things without enough evidence? And I think you'll find there's a lot there. And among those things are that there are bad consequences, right? Our beliefs are not just floating out there doing nothing, right? Our beliefs determine what we do. They determine how we act. They determine how we relate to others, and they're very, very important in that sense. And so, because our beliefs really affect the way that we act, right? When we act on beliefs that we haven't taken enough care of, we are going to end up doing bad things, and we shouldn't do that. So that's again, his argument is very strongly consequential. And you sort of have to take what he says and sort of apply it then to various kinds of spiritual or religious beliefs to really get the idea that of the way he's arguing here. So again, pay very, very, very close attention to the text itself and why is he making the arguments that he makes? How do those arguments apply in the broader context? And of course, you want to contrast this with some of the arguments by William James here. Now, James is giving what is, it's so easy to oversimplify James's argument. And I would really caution you not to do that. James is not saying, oh, well, it's just okay to have religious beliefs even if you don't have evidence, and that's that, right? You don't have to have evidence for everything, yada, yada. And so that makes James sound like a very intellectually lax person indeed. And I assure you, right, from if you read anything that he wrote, that is not in any way the case, okay? James's argument is much more subtle than that, and it's very much more pointed than that, right? In fact, he says, look, not every belief has the same evidentiary standard. Okay, there are some beliefs that you could have, that are reasonable to have with less evidence, and some beliefs that you really should require much more evidence to have. And his main question is, what category do specifically religious beliefs fit in? Right. Now, there's a lot of tension between Clifford and James here, but I suspect there's also quite a lot of agreement. I think in most cases, James would say it would be irresponsible to allow information to guide your behavior if you didn't really have enough evidence for that information, right? If like I said, I think there's probably quite a lot of harmony between the two cases. However, there might be, right, some room for some split between the two of them, how they would deal with specifically religious beliefs. And again, James is not going to say, well, look, it's just okay sometimes to believe stuff without evidence. That's not at all what he's doing. He says, look, there are very specific kinds of beliefs that for very specific reasons might have much less of an evidentiary standard to them. And he thinks that religious beliefs may fit that category. And of course, his reasoning is not unassailable, right? It's something that really ought to be examined. He might be right, but he might not. And again, the claims deserve very careful examination. Finally, the text rounds this discussion out with the very cheerful writings of Søren Kierkegaard. And again, if you want the 5-cent version, which does not at all replicate the nuance and the detail and in a lot of cases the beauty of his writing, is that he tends to regard religion as a kind of offense to the intellect, right? And yet points out that there are certain things about it that can be worthwhile to a person who manages to be able to believe in spite of the sort of intellectual problems with doing so. I'll not say a lot about Kierkegaard here, but just a little bit of background. He wrote an awful lot of stuff, and the stuff he wrote is not particularly cheerful. He tended to suffer from very, very serious depression. In fact, may have had some graphomania, that is a sort of obsessive compulsive writing as a kind of coping response. there are a lot of things he wrote concerned the distinction between despair and depression, right? What the difference between those two things is. And so, in fact, famously, the Austrian philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein had remarked once to somebody who'd asked him about Kierkegaard. He says, "Well, I can't pretend to understand everything that he's written, but from what I gather, we're not here to have a good time." That was the way that Wittgenstein summarized it, and I think that's that witticism has survived, I think, for a reason, because there's at least a kernel of truth in that. But in any case, again, the reading itself is really going to give you the best idea there. But notice that there is this fundamental tension in Kierkegaard between the intellectual aspects that on their face, right? There's a lot about religious life that doesn't make a lot of sense, and yet Kierkegaard is trying to explain what there might be in it, even so. And so as a it's a very important, very nuanced, very, very difficult set of writing, but it can be, I think, rewarding. Okay. So that's that, and here you are at the end of my remarks. I hope they've been helpful. If not, do please ask as many questions as you can think to ask. Right? There's I assure you, your instructor has no way of knowing if you're struggling with a particular idea or a particular concept if you don't then ask questions about it. And very often people are like, "Well, I just didn't know what to ask." It's like, well, that means you didn't try to figure out what to ask. You got to start somewhere. Even if you don't ask the right question the first time, that'll probably lead you to a slightly better one. But you do have to actually start somewhere. You got to have something to fix before you can fix it. So anyway, happy reading, happy writing, and I sort of look forward to any questions that you might have.